My name is Eric Nelson. Thank you for attending my seminar, which is titled Challenging the Empirical Legitimacy of Domestic Violence Experts in Criminal, Civil, and Family Law Cases. This seminar draws heavily on material from two of my books, the Judicial War on Men and Attorney Deposition Guide for Questioning a Domestic Violence Expert. Both of these are available at aeqpub.com. That's aeqpub.com. Okay, overview of the seminar. I'm going to start by making an empirical and legal statement about domestic violence. Then I'm going to talk about domestic violence experts and what their typical characteristics are. Then I'm going to talk about the characteristics of good science, empirical science. Then I'm going to talk about the characteristics of unreliable or bad science. After that, we'll talk about typical claims made by domestic violence experts regarding DV. Then I'm going to share empirical facts about domestic violence. And then after that, I'm going to subject typical claims made by DV experts about DV. I'm going to subject those to empirical review. After that, I'm going to talk about empirical facts about false accusations. Then I'm going to describe typical failings of defense attorneys who represent falsely accused men. After that, I'm going to actually not only talk about, but show you what judges are taught about issuing domestic violence restraining orders. And finally, I'm going to give you some strategies to employ if your client is falsely accused. Topic 1, empirical and legal statement about domestic violence. Okay, domestic violence occurs. And some accusations of DV are true, some are false, and both true and false accusations of DV come before the court in family law cases, criminal cases, and civil cases. Often the court is informed and advised by DV experts who testify to an empirically false set of facts. Topic 2, domestic violence experts and their typical characteristics. So domestic violence experts are individuals who testify and write reports for family, civil, and criminal cases. There is no consistent standard existing which establishes minimal empirical knowledge, skills, and experience before someone can testify as a domestic violence expert. In court, therefore, it is the wild, wild west where anybody can identify themselves as a DV expert and they can testify, evaluate cases, and give advice to judges. Domestic violence experts perpetuate 13 widely accepted claims regarding DV. Domestic violence experts also train judges, and typically judges believe their claims about DV are scientifically true. Consequently, as you're going to see, there's a real and present danger that domestic violence experts will trigger pro-female and anti-male implicit bias in the minds and rulings of judges, and that these biases will show up in their court decisions against your client. Domestic violence experts give the court cover to impose biased rulings on men, including denial of due process rights, loss of custody, and visitation, etc. Topic 3. So what are the characteristics of empirical, aka good science? You see large randomly selected groups being studied, typically at least 400 or more. Study participants are carefully selected to ensure they mirror the full group that they are said to represent. Dozens of variables are assessed for collinearity and other confounds, and they're eliminated. Regression and other advanced mathematics are used to identify significant and non-significant relationships between variables and outcomes of interest. High mathematical standards are applied when assessing for significance. Cause is only argued after extensive complex analysis. Guesswork is absolutely forbidden, and violation of the rules is absolutely forbidden. Empirical science is the only method used to test food, medicine, and consumer products for safety. Topic 4, characteristics of unreliable or bad science. Typically, small unrepresentative samples are used. Sound statistical methods are rejected. Guessed interpretation is presented as fact. The terminology of empiricism is purloined to make the findings of bad science sound credible. Dogma is imposed to bend these findings to confirm predetermined agenda. Nearly all DV experts, not surprisingly, make claims about DV that arise from studies that were conducted using methods of bad science. Now, these same methods are forbidden for the use by every federal, state, and private safety testing organization. For example, if the Food and Drug Administration used these methods, drugs would be approved that would harm or kill children and other people. If the Highway Administration used these methods, they would approve construction plans for bridges that would later fall down. If the Agricultural Department used these methods, they would approve as safe pesticides that actually made food poisonous. If the Federal Aviation Administration used these methods, many more planes would crash, and if NASA used these methods, many more rockets would explode and crash. So the question then has to be asked, why does the court allow DV experts to make claims about domestic violence that are derived from bad science? Okay, topic 5, typical claims made by domestic violence experts regarding DV. Women are not violent against men unless it's in self-defense while being battered. In the typical heterosexual DV situation, the man is the abuser, the woman is the victim. Typically, men are not victims of DV. Bilateral, non-self-defensive mutual combat between male and female partners is rare. The number of reported and unreported cases of women being battered by men is extremely high. Women are at risk of being killed when they separate from a male partner. 52-week DV treatment programs reduce the chances a man will batter again in the future. Domestic violence escalates over time. First it's verbal, then it's pushing, then it's hitting, then sometimes killing. DV is not an anger issue. It is about a man seeking power and control over his female victim. DV includes psychological abuse meant to exert power and control over the partner. The cycle of violence model predicts that violence is repetitive, and once it has begun, it will continue. Abuse and violence are not the goal of DV. The goal is to obtain power and control. And finally, the power and control wheel explains the specific acts of DV alleged against your client in the instant case. Okay, here's a quiz. How many of the 13 claims about DV have been empirically validated as true? What harms would come to your client as a result of the domestic violence expert forming conclusions and making recommendations based upon the 13 DV dogma? Would you take the deposition of your opponent's domestic violence expert? If you do depose the domestic violence expert, what would your goals be? What questions would you ask? What type of record would you try to create? If the domestic violence expert lacks empirical knowledge, skills, and abilities, how will you exploit this factor in questioning? Will you file a motion to disqualify the domestic violence expert? How will you establish the foundation? And finally, suppose the domestic violence expert cites substantiation for all 13 DV dogma. How would you determine if the substantiation that she cites is empirically valid or not? Okay, topic 6, empirical facts about domestic violence. The chart you see there is from a study, a worldwide study, looked at 32 different countries. As you can see, a bunch of different countries are listed along the bottom. Above each country is a blue line and a red line. Blue is for male, red is for female. This is for minor DV. And as you can see, in nearly all countries of the world, females commit more minor DV than males. By the way, this data is obtained from females admitting violence and also males admitting violence. Well, as it turns out, about 78 to 80% of all DV is minor in nature. So what is it? Pushing, shoving, slapping. Minor DV leaves no visible injuries. So about 4/5, 78 to 80% of all DV is minor in nature. So who experiences it? Well, about 30% of females, 26% of males, 36% of lesbians, 24% of gay males will experience minor DV at least once in their lifetime. Worldwide, males and females admit perpetuating minor DV at about equal rates. Okay, the figure on the right, severe DV worldwide. Same countries again. Males again are blue, females are red. We know that about 20 to 22% of all DV is severe. That's where you get broken bones, lacerations, large bruises. Who experiences it? Well, about 24% of females, about 14% of males, about 29% of lesbians, about 16% of gay males will experience severe DV at least once in their lifetime. And worldwide, males and females admit perpetuating severe DV at about equal rates. Okay, what you see there is the wheel that describes 7 types of domestic violence. It's organized by type of dyad. Dyad is a group of 2 people, so it's organized by dyad and direction of violence. The arrows pointing one direction means one member of the dyad is beating the other. Arrows going both directions mean they're both non-self-defensively beating each other. So starting at the top right, we see 2 lesbians both beating each other. Down below that, going clockwise, we see 1 lesbian beating the other. Below that, we see a female beating a male. At the bottom, we see male and female, and they're both beating each other. Continuing clockwise, we see a male beating a female. This is the only type that nearly all domestic violence research looks at. The other 6 are mostly ignored. Continuing up counterclockwise, we see 1 gay male beating the other. And finally, at about the 10.5 position, we see 2 gay males beating each other. So that's the 7 types of DV organized according to dyad and direction of violence. Okay, look at the charts there. The one on the left is a plot of FBI data for all types of violent crime. The one on the right is a plot of data from a study that I conducted. The study I conducted was the largest study of its type ever. Looked at hundreds of data from both police and their corresponding prosecution files. And what you see in both charts is rates of violence are higher at younger ages, and as aging increases, going to the right, rates of violence drop. Okay, let's see what the numbers are. For the left, the FBI data, female violence peaks at around age 21 and it decreases to about 0 at age 60. The rate of decrease is about 2.56% per year. Male violence peaks at around age 18, decreases to 0 at about age 60. The rate of decrease is about 2.38% per year. On the right, for domestic violence, we see that female DV peaks at around age 22, decreases to about 0 at age 60. Interestingly, the rate of decrease is exactly the same, 2.56. For males, interestingly, DV peaks at around age 28 and decreases to 0 at about age 60. The rate of decrease is about 3.13%. What this tells you is that as you age, you naturally become less violent. Without any treatment, without any drugs, just as a function of getting older, you're less and less violent. Hang on to this. We're going to come back to this statistic in a few minutes. Okay, more facts about DV. Here's a fact for you. The risk of DV homicide is essentially 0. Leaving a relationship is actually a very, very safe activity. Another fact for you, in an average year, a female who batters a male partner will commit 43 acts of controlling abuse, 29 acts of severe psychological abuse, 47 acts of violence, and the male will sustain about 12 injuries. Now, we know that males are significantly less likely to report DV when their abuser is female. So those are some more facts about DV. Okay, topic 7, subjecting claims of DV experts to empirical review. The chart there you see is some of that same worldwide study, the largest, best, and most empirical study, 32 different countries. Countries are listed along the bottom. What you're looking at is rates of non-self-defensive mutual battering. And as you can see, country by country, it's anywhere from roughly 50 to 70% of all DV. So about 2/3 of all DV is both parties beating on each other. And this is confirmed further by epidemiological and survey studies that continue to confirm that females are as abusive as males. Okay, now we're going to start to look at those 13 claims that DV experts make. So the first one, generally women are not violent against men unless it is in self-defense while being battered. Well, as we've already seen, not true. DV claim number 2, in the typical heterosexual DV situation, the man is the abuser and the woman is the victim. As we've now learned, not true. DV claim number 3, typically men are not victims of DV. As we've actually learned, and if you look carefully at the data, men are slightly more often victims of DV. So that one is also proven untrue. DV claim number 4, bilateral non-self-defensive mutual combat between male and female partners is rare. Well, as the chart on the right shows, no, it's not only not rare, it's the most common form at about 2/3. So that claim is also shown to be untrue. All right, continuing, DV claim number 5. The number of reported and unreported cases of women being battered by men is extremely high. Well, we actually know the risk of experiencing DV in a given year for all ages average is about 1% for both males and females. In other words, 99% of the population is DV free in any given year. The rate is higher if you're younger, lower if you're older, essentially zero after about age 60. So that claim is also shown to be not true. Next one, DV claim number 6. Women are at risk of being killed when they separate from a male partner. We actually know the risk of being killed upon separation is less than 1 in 10,000 for either men or women. In other words, the risk is essentially zero. That claim is also therefore just proven to be untrue. Okay, number 7. 52-week DV treatment programs reduce the chances a man will batter again in the future. Well, as we know from good empirical studies, programs have been proven not to work. And as you remember from those 2 charts where as people get older, they just naturally are becoming less violent, when you factor those in, what you actually find is it's possible that DV 52-week programs actually increase rates of domestic violence recidivism. So that claim is also shown to be not true. Next one, DV claim number 8. DV escalates over time, first verbal, then pushing, then hitting, then sometimes killing. Well, as it turns out, there's no empirical evidence to support or disprove this claim. But because it hasn't been proven, we're going to give it a slash. Okay, DV claim number 9. DV isn't an anger issue. It's about a man seeking power and control over his female victim. Well, that's dogma only. There's no empirical evidence to show it to be true. Okay, number 10. DV includes psychological abuse meant to exert power and control over the partner. Well, as we know, because we've actually gone out and asked men why they did it and asked women why they did it. Men say they did it 55% of the time. They say they did it to get attention. 47% of the time they said they did it because they're angry. 28% of the time they said they did it for retaliation. When women batterers are asked, they say they battered because they were angry. They say that about 68% of the time, to gain attention 53% of the time, retaliation 49% of the time. Interestingly, neither women nor men say that they commit DV to exert power and control. So we're going to give that one a slash mark also. Okay, DV claim number 11. The cycle of violence model predicts that violence is repetitive once it has begun. Well, it turns out there is no cycle of violence model. There's a whole bunch of them. They're different versions. But in any case, all of them are dogma only. There is no empirical evidence which validates the predictive ability of the cycle of violence model. So that one will get a slash mark. 12, abuse and violence are not the goal of DV. The goal is to obtain power and control. Well, as we know, that's dogma only because we actually know what the real reasons are. We just read them. There's no empirical evidence to validate this belief. Consequently, it also is going to get a slash. And DV claim number 13, the power and control wheel explains the specific acts of your client in the present case. Well, it's dogma only. There's no empirical evidence to validate that claim if it's made by the DV expert. And so consequently, as you're going to see, you should probably go after that. Okay, topic number 8, empirical facts about false accusations. Turns out about half of all rape accusations, let me say that again, about half of all rape accusations are false. If they're properly investigated, about 45% can be proven to be false. So we asked women, why do you make false accusations of rape? Well, 53%, a little bit over half, say they did it to create an alibi for a possible pregnancy or a possible sexually transmitted disease. This should scare you. About 44% say that they make a false accusation of rape as an act of revenge. And typically explanations will be, well, I thought this was the marker of a new relationship, and for him it was just sex, and I'm going to get him back. So about 44% admit they did it for revenge. Okay, in high conflict divorce and child custody cases with unsubstantiated accusations of DV. So this is going to be where you haven't heard about DV before, there's no police reports. The first time it comes up is when you're arguing over custody or divorce. Turns out females make these accusations, make false accusations. Females make false accusations of DV, about 17% of these cases. Males in about 3.9%. Mathematically, therefore, females are about 435% more likely to make false accusations in these types of cases. You can learn more about false accusations of rape and domestic violence in chapters 9, 10, and 11 of my book, The Judicial War on Men. Okay, topic 9, the one the attorneys have been dreading. Topic 9, typical failures of attorneys who represent falsely accused men. Well, the attorneys are failing to challenge the empirical knowledge, skills, and abilities of opponents' domestic violence expert. Attorneys are failing to empirically challenge claims about DV made by opponents' domestic violence expert. And attorneys are failing to file a motion to disqualify opponents' domestic violence expert. So as a consequence, an epidemic of empirically unqualified domestic violence experts making empirically false claims about DV has flourished and become the status quo in family, criminal, and civil law. Also, as a consequence, women who make false accusations have been automatically believed, shielded from investigation, and shielded from testifying and cross-examination. Additional consequences: female batterers have been treated as victims, innocent men have been harmed, children have been deprived of their fathers, lives have been ruined, a tremendous inequity has been perpetuated, and the legal and judicial fields have been duped. Topic 10, what judges are taught about issuing domestic violence restraining orders. Okay, so the following video experts I'm going to show you are taken from multiple training videos produced by the Judicial Council of California. I obtained these through a Rule 10500 series of Rule 10500 requests, and they're being used under the Fair Use Doctrine for educational purposes. You're going to see two presiding judges, family law judges, provide annual DV and domestic violence restraining order training to their fellow judges. These films have never been seen before by the public before now. And as you're going to see, these training judges are going to teach judges you do not have to make a finding of domestic violence in order to order a domestic violence restraining order. No DV is required. You're going to see them say that if you don't issue a DVRO, you'll be overruled by the Court of Appeal. Well, that's interesting. So we're not talking about necessarily the facts of the case. We're not necessarily talking about due process. You will hear with your own ears, judges are being told, if you do not issue a domestic violence restraining order, you will be overruled by the Court of Appeal. They're going to admit DVROs are misused to get free hearings that quickly resolve multiple issues rather than going through the normal judicial process. And you're also going to hear them acknowledge people seeking DVROs are sometimes lying. Okay, here you go. No domestic violence is required to issue a domestic violence restraining order.
Simply because you do not grant a domestic violence restraining order, you have fundamental jurisdiction in that proceeding to make other orders. And go look at the statute and you'll see the following. It doesn't say in the statute, if you find DV, then you may order restraining orders, then you may order child support, then you may order child custody, then you may order spousal support, then you may order property use. It simply says that in an action brought under this part, not to bore ourselves too much with what that all means, but it just essentially means it's a separate proceeding under the Family Code, you may make the following kinds of orders: a DV protection order, a support order, a custody order. It's not conditional upon first finding DV.
Okay? Now, here's the warning. Don't issue a domestic violence restraining order. You will be reversed by the Court of Appeal.
Yeah, I would just add one other thing. All of the published cases in the last few years have essentially, if you looked at it from 30,000 feet, don't grant a restraining order, face a likely reversal.
Reversal.
Face a likely reversal. One thing we do know is that the Court of Appeal will look very closely at denials of restraining orders. And what we do know is that the reversal rate has been extremely high where restraining orders have not been granted.
What used to be called marriage of Grissom is now marriage of G, is one that I think is really important this year, because every year for the last 4 or 5 years I've been doing the domestic violence cases. I've been telling you that you really need to be careful not granting domestic violence orders, because the courts of appeal have been very liberal in making determinations again since Nat Carney that there is some things that can happen that are going to be worthy of a domestic violence restraining order. So be very careful about not granting it.
Here you're going to see the judges acknowledging that people lie on domestic violence restraining order applications and misuse the DVRO process.
Kind of a case is, if you have no DV at all there, you could file an action that clearly has no DV. You don't even have to lie. You can say, I want a domestic violence restraining order because my husband said he's going to fight me for the kids. Knowing full well that that's true, but that it's not DV. And then say, and by the way, I want child support, spousal support, and in these days where we're already suffering economically, this just gives another opportunity for somebody to come in and get a child support, child custody, child visitation, spousal support, temporary use of property, and the courts have collected no filing fee. So I think,
and I don't disagree that many people will use the DV action for other purposes, because there's lots of strategic reasons to use DVPA because of its effect on custody, because of its effect on spousal support. So certainly that's true. Well,
Judge Mize is going to sum it up for men.
And as I said, I can summarize this case in 7 words. Once you say, I do, you're done.
Okay, topic 11, strategy to employ if your client is falsely accused. First thing you need to do is buy my books, Judicial War on Men, Attorney Deposition Guide, and you need to memorize them. You don't just read them once, you don't just read them twice. You turn off your phone, you go away from the weekend, you read them, you mark them up. You will not find this anywhere else. That's it. These are your only resources. Read them, memorize them, prepare yourself to take care of your falsely accused clients. You can get them at aeqpub.com, aeqpub.com. Okay. So, how about if you depose the domestic violence expert, opponent's domestic violence expert, in order to elicit admissions that can be used in a motion to disqualify? Well, how do you do that? Well, first of all, obtain their curriculum vitae, and during deposition ask them questions about their empirical knowledge, skills, and experience. Then after that, administer the empirical capability assessment tool. That's in chapter 2 of my Depo book. Buy the book, you're allowed to use the test. Here's how it works. Okay, so there you've got the judge in the background who already knows he has to issue a DVRO. On the left you have the domestic violence expert, and on the right you have attorney courageous. Because attorney courageous has decided to step outside the box, take a risk, and challenge opponent's domestic violence expert. And as you can see, opponent's domestic violence expert is shocked. She's never been challenged before with questions such as, what P level would cause you to reject as unreliable a study that you're reading? What is a spurious finding? What analytical methods can detect spurious findings? What sampling methods are likely to produce results that cannot be generalized? What is attribution error? Please provide 3 examples of attribution error. How does the relationship between mean and standard deviation give a view on the consistency of outcomes? What's dummy data? How are dummy data constructed? What type of mathematical processes can dummy data be used in? What are key differences and similarities between ordinary least squares regression and logistic regression? What participant selection methods would cause you to reject as unreliable a study that you're reading? Can propensity scores be regressed? And if yes, what type of regression should be used and why? What type of error does a longitudinal study try to control? How does regression modeling detect collinear variables? Now, a person with empirical knowledge, skills, and abilities will be able to answer these questions correctly. A person who cannot answer them and is unable to distinguish between well-done research and unscientific garbage, well, how is that person going to be able to tell you true facts about domestic violence. Okay, so next step. Have the domestic violence expert state the characteristics of DV. Create a record showing their reliance on disproven, unscientific dogma used to explain DV. Remember, we're still back in the depot. Lock them into it. 4, go over each DV characteristics they've described and demanding they identify scientific substantiation for each. You're creating a record showing they can't do it. You may find as a result of the deposition, the domestic violence expert may become demoralized and unsettled by having to admit they lack empirical knowledge, skills, and experience, not being able to answer the ECAT questions, being challenged on what they believed or settled facts about DV, not being able to cite scientific support for the characteristics of DV which they've described, starting to question whether or not they're actually a DV expert, and realizing they're going to have to go through this again when you put them on the stand in court. Okay, after you've gotten that deposition, you should obtain an expert evaluation of the domestic violence expert's empirical knowledge, skills, and experience, and their capability to parse between good research and bad, their ability to testify to true facts about DV, the risk of harm to your client if false facts about DV are allowed to be presented to the court, and then when all that's done, you should file a motion to disqualify, and if such is warranted by the facts of the case and your legal strategy. Okay, you can learn more in my book called Attorney Deposition Guide for Questioning Domestic Violence Expert at aeqpub.com, aeqpub.com. All right, thanks for listening to my presentation, and now we are going to go to questions.